If you've spent any time researching or reviewing MacBooks on YouTube, you've probably come to realize that most reviewers are pretty biased when it comes to MacBooks. They're either unnecessarily hating on it or absolutely glazing Apple, especially when it comes to the M2 MacBook Air, where Apple made the decision to split the SSDs, thus slowing it down, which means this MacBook Air is extremely controversial to review and to test because of the SSD differences. So this video is about why I got the base model MacBook Air and why I think it's still such a great buy in 2024. There's a couple reasons why I think it's so great, and I'm going to go over why I think you might just consider getting a base model MacBook Air in 2024, even with the M3. Base model MacBook Air has always been popular among students, travelers, and anyone who doesn't want to pay for everything that Apple wants to charge you for. Mostly because it's light and inexpensive to buy relative to some of the higher end MacBook Pro model. And because it's extremely powerful at its price point because of the M2, M3, and M1 series Apple Silicon chips, which absolutely fly in anything that you throw at it. Which is one of the reasons why I got one, because I knew it could handle everything I wanted it to do, even at that base spec. So this video is going over everything that I use my MacBook Air for and everything that you might want to know about the base model MacBook Air that no one else on YouTube seems to tell you about. So first we'll talk about its everyday use, then gaming, video editing, photo editing, and finally let's talk about the SSD speeds in this base model MacBook Air, because that I have some interesting feedback about. As far as everyday use, I'm just checking email, web browsing, and using FaceTime. And starting with email, obviously this absolutely flies. Even on my old Chromebook, email would run perfectly fine. So if you use your MacBook for email, you shouldn't even worry about it. But as far as web browsing, this thing absolutely flies, and that's probably in tandem with Apple's powerful Safari, which has just become really integrated with the MacBook and the iPhone. Safari is great, especially if you don't want your RAM bogged down like Chrome does. Safari is just a great browser to use, especially on a MacBook, because it's so wicked fast. Websites load within milliseconds, and you can have multiple tabs open without even stuttering, especially when you have other windows open. When I'm coding, I like to have Xcode, ChatGPT, and Safari open to look up Apple's own documentation for coding, and it doesn't even stutter, especially when I'm coding and compiling and doing all this complex stuff. It doesn't even stutter. Now, that's not to say after long extended periods of use that it doesn't start to slow down, because it does, and most computers are going to do that. Even if you get a MacBook Pro, after a couple hours, you're going to start to see it slow down just a little bit because of that throttling. But honestly, web browsing absolutely flies on this thing. And FaceTime is also great on the MacBook Airs too, because the M2 MacBook Air has an upgraded 1080p webcam, which sounds better than a 720p one. It looks slightly better. Having anything less than a 1080p webcam on a computer nowadays is kind of just, why would you even put it on there? It's just too low resolution, whatever. But the webcam looks great, and FaceTime actually runs really good on the MacBooks, and it's what a lot of people use it for. Now, people like to joke about how Apple puts 8 gigabytes of RAM in the base model MacBook Air, and that is true. It is kind of a joke. 8 gigabytes of RAM in 2024 is pretty paltry compared to what you can get with some other Windows computers for the price. But honestly, even with multiple intensive tabs open on Safari, you really don't see that many stutters or slowdowns. And I think even with future proofing, maybe just bumping up to that 16 gigabyte model if you know you're going to be using lots of tabs open. But honestly, if you're using it for web browsing and email, base model is going to run perfectly fine. It's not even a question. It runs amazing. And this is what I should also probably mention, that unlike lots of other computer brands out there like Dell and Lenovo, getting a higher spec model doesn't give you any base features like any differently. Like if I get the 16 gigabyte model, I'm not going to be getting a different webcam or a different trackpad. It's going to be the same hardware, except for some of those internal specs that you can't upgrade. Like lots of other computer companies, if you get a higher spec model, you'll get a different webcam or something. Apple doesn't do that. The only thing that could be different is if you bump up to a higher spec model, you might get a different charging brick, but it's none of the internal hardware is being changed by upgrading that spec, which makes getting the base model MacBook Air even better because you're getting all the features that people who are buying the $3,000 spec'd out version of it are getting, and you guys are getting the same experience even what spec you buy, which makes the base model MacBook Air even a better deal when you start to think about it. Next, I do want to talk about gaming on the MacBook because it's pretty interesting the situation that Apple has put the MacBooks in as far as gaming. And everybody knows MacBooks aren't that great at gaming, but Apple has really gotten a lot better at gaming in the last couple updates, especially with Gaming Mode addition to macOS Ventura and some new game porting tools in Metal that they're providing with these newer updates. So in the future, even in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to see a lot more games having compatibility for macOS, which is going to be great, especially in the future. If you want light gaming on your MacBook, but obviously the MacBook is not great at intensive gaming. That's no surprise. And even with my testing, running some of those higher end games like League of Legends or Cyberpunk, those are not going to run great on a MacBook, even if you have a fully spec'd out MacBook Pro, mostly because they're not taking full advantage of the Mac's hardware, which is trying to get a little bit more parity with the games and MacBooks, but there's just not a ton of support out there for macOS. So the games I did test on the MacBook Air was Minecraft and Roblox, which both seem to have native support for Apple's ARM structure. So from Roblox, I think I was seeing basically about 60 FPS in high settings, which is honestly really good. Even on high setting, on some of those really intensive games, I was seeing it run perfectly fine. Even after half hour, an hour of gaming, I was still seeing it run at high settings in that 60 FPS range, which is really great, especially for a base model MacBook Air. And Minecraft 2, it seems like Minecraft could basically run on a potato, which we all know that, but it's no surprise that Minecraft could run really smoothly on vanilla Minecraft in medium settings, which is kind of great because Minecraft is like the perfect game for the MacBook because it's obviously could run on basically nothing but a potato, so there is that. But if you want to get even higher potential FPS in Minecraft with mods, you can start seeing like 120, 150 FPS even on the base model MacBook Air. But I was starting to see about 75 FPS consistently in Minecraft on the MacBook Air. If you guys want to see a fully detailed video about gaming performance on the MacBook Air, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to check that out in a later video. Now, the base model MacBook Air's video editing performance has not been shown very much on YouTube, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video because I have personally edited multiple 4K YouTube videos, short films, and promotional videos with graphics, transitions, and more on my base model MacBook Air, and to no surprise, it absolutely crushed it every single time. And it's kind of testament to Apple's new M2 chips and M3 chips, which run video editing performance really good with those specific cores for that neural network. So for reference, most of my video editing was actually done in DaVinci Resolve, which is a free program, and it seemed to run really, really good even with a non-native app like DaVinci Resolve. Now, I think if I had tested it on like Final Cut Pro or something like that, that Apple has native support for, it would have run even better, which is kind of no surprise because most of those Apple native apps just run really well on Apple's hardware. DaVinci Resolve has served me really well even for the free version on the MacBook Air. Everything is really quick and snappy when editing on the go, even disconnected from my desk setup here. And especially when I'm dealing with multiple 4K streams, there's very little slowdown, especially when you have some of those long extended editing sessions. But I guess it makes sense that even after like half hour, an hour, the throttling kicks in and it definitely starts to slow down. So if you are editing very intensive footage, you're not going to be able to edit for very long. That sustained performance is going to dip very quickly, especially after like half hour or 35 minutes of editing. You're gonna start to see that slowdown, which is one of the disadvantages of video editing, and it's not one that people talk about very much. But the editing performance slows down very quickly, even if it's at that high sustained performance right away. The throttling kicks in really quickly, especially because the MacBook Air, as you know, doesn't even have a fan in it. You'll definitely start to see better performance if you get a MacBook Pro, but since this is about the base model MacBook Air, we're just going to talk about that. I feel like it does video editing pretty decently for what the specs are, 8 gigabytes of RAM and just the base model M2 processor. But if you're on the fence about this MacBook's video editing performance, especially if you're doing 4K video streams or graphics or something, it's going to work really well, and I promise that it will work well for what you're trying to do with that 4K video editing and graphics and transitions. It does it surprisingly well. And even if you are starting to do some of that like 8K footage, or you're doing, hour-long feature film editing, obviously you're going to want to get a MacBook Pro, and those people will know who they are. If you know you need a MacBook Pro, you're going to get a MacBook Pro. But if you're on the fence about video editing, this thing flies. Switching gears briefly to talk about the photo editing performance on the MacBook Pro, which is something that a lot of people say they end up doing. Obviously, photo editing isn't something super intensive or something that people are doing all that often, even on a MacBook Air. But no surprise, it completely flies through editing Pro RAW photos from Apple's own codec, which really shouldn't be surprised because it crushes at virtually everything else. Photoshop and Lightroom both run natively and are both very consistent in performance, and if web-based photo editing and complex photo editing is more of your thing, Canva and Figma both run great, and exporting is lightning quick on the MacBook Air. If you're worried about color reproduction, the MacBook Air's display supports P3 color, which is good for most basic levels of photo editing, and it's a great reason why you should just get the MacBook Air. Lastly, I want to discuss the SSD situation with the base model MacBook Airs. So if you're not aware, Apple basically split the 256GB SSD internally on the MacBook Air into two 128GB sticks, which is basically means on paper that it's slower when transferring files and videos and photos from an SSD to the MacBook Air. I don't really transfer that many files on and off my MacBook Air, but I did a quick little test with some larger files, and it's really not all that noticeable despite what people are going to try and make you think. If you put an M3 Air, an M1 Air, and an M2 Air all together and you transfer files, 100% you would notice a difference. But that's not to say that you're going to be doing that very often, and even if you are, it's really not going to be that noticeable. Modern computers are pretty fast at transferring files off an SSD, and that's not really something you should be worried about, and it's not something that should hold you back from getting the base model MacBook Air, especially if you can't even afford a higher spec version. Lots of people are trying to say that you can't get the base model MacBook Air because the RAM and whatever. It's going to be perfectly fine. Don't even worry about it. The speeds are fine, and you can go watch a video on a speed comparison for the SSDs, but it's really not that noticeable. Even if you're doing some basic, .txt files back and forth, you're really not going to notice much of a difference. Lots of people, including Marques Brownlee, have said not to buy the base model MacBook Air, especially because of that SSD issue, almost exclusively. And it's really interesting because most of these people haven't used a base model MacBook Air for longer than a week. And honestly, if you're using this, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about the SSD issue. I can definitely vouch that it's not that slow. With all the other models out there, the M1, the M3, the M2 base model MacBook Air remains the best out of all the other options out there, mostly because of its price. It recently went down to $799 on Amazon and Best Buy, which is honestly kind of a steal for what you're getting. If you had any doubts about this machine, hopefully I answered them. But if you still have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.